All right, mates, welcome back to the channel. JL Scott Fishing. Hope everybody is doing well. We are back, and we are going to talk a little bit today about a couple developments going on in Virginia, in Northern Virginia. We had an opportunity to get out and visit Lake Brittle this last week. First time on this body of water for me in probably 30 years. And that's kind of crazy, growing up in Northern Virginia. But so many more places and so many things opened up over throughout the years. And it's one of the oldest Virginia DWR bodies of water. It is designated as a fishing lake. And not all lakes in Virginia are designated as public fishing lakes. Okay, so that's an interesting designation for that, which means that's really the only recreational type. You can't camp there. There are a lot of restrictions you can't do on fishing lakes that you can do on big lakes and things that are recreational, boater, all of that stuff in different states. It's important to know those regulations, for your state and for your specific lakes, how they're designated, what you can, what you cannot do, all that good stuff. So it's under 100 acres. It's 77 acres. So it's not, relative to a lot of other bodies of water, that most people are more familiar with in Virginia. It's on the smaller side. You also had the development for Lake Brittle where it was pretty much a local gem for a long time, for a lot of anglers that you talk to, especially those that are older than me. Because Lake Manassas is pretty close, close proximity in the county next door, more or less, and it was bigger and more popular, and then some developments happened on Lake Manassas where they shut Lake Manassas down, and then a lot of people gravitated to the next closest lake that may not have ever fished it before, and that's Lake Brittle. And so it did get a little bit more pressure. What's interesting about the lake is pretty typical of Virginia, the smaller Virginia lakes, with bluegill and red deer, black crappie populations. But what a lot of people forget or may not know is Brittle was one of the places where Virginia DWR introduced flathead catfish, like in the 90s. It was back then. Again, science has changed. And there's a huge debate. You can check out Fishing the DMV for a flathead catfish video from Thomas Ahrens in the DMV region. What we know about flathead catfish today is a lot different, I think, than what the biologists knew in the late 80s and 90s. But they introduced flathead catfish in two different times. And it was an effort to control populations in this lake that at the time, the forage species, they thought were getting overabundant, which is kind of interesting because you don't hear that very much anymore. We hear now about how forage is in smaller supply and limited supply in a lot of places. Not that there was an overabundance of gizzard shad or bullhead or whatever, right? And so they basically felt like they had to control those populations and the sunfish populations in order to bring balance back in the 90s to the fishery, which has had issues because of its purpose. It's not that deep to begin with. Most places it's 7-8 feet, and predominantly most places. So it's a great place to fish, for people who like to fish shallow. I think the largest it gets is about 25 or 26 feet deep, in sections, and so it's an interesting place. It's got a really, you can see my video on the channel of pulling into Lake Brittle. The launch, it's a very narrow launch. It's got a pier for people. It's got rentals during the spring and summertime. People can take boats out, kayaks, canoes. It is really a chill place, to be honest with you. Now, what I'm going to talk about a little bit, I'll combine this about Lake Brittle because I think it's interesting in the Northern Virginia, and it's something that very few people really cover. Obviously, we know we've got a huge, abundant largemouth bass fishing population in the DMV. Okay, we've got the smallmouth crowd, which is growing more and more as the Upper Potomac comes back. But you also have other species, that I encountered on Lake Brittle in my visit, and that's walleye. And most people don't think about walleye in the DMV. It's not really in our rivers, the Potomac, okay, which is the predominant body of water, tidal and Upper Potomac, of any consequence. And so it is really confined to stocking programs for Virginia DWR, on the other side of the Potomac, where they have actually been committed to stocking these species that have declined or just an introduction. Now, Lake Brittle had run into issues with hydrilla, like a lot of lakes in the South. They kind of got out of control. It also had issues where renovation, reconstruction, and all that. This is one of the oldest lakes, DWR lakes in the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, and they had to repair, I think it's the spillway. I think that's what it basically was. They had to basically draw down a lake, which never is a good thing when it comes to fish populations, especially for long periods of time. We've seen that. But they introduced walleye to the tune of 200 walleye per acre. So think about that. So when people talk a little bit about Virginia DWR and their stocking efforts, again, it's important to kind of know what the facts are. I mean, 200 fish times 77 acres. Think about that. That's a lot. That's a lot of walleye. And because the smaller walleyes, the walleye spawn and the walleye offspring were struggling to survive versus the older population that they were finding. And this is what required an increase in the amount that they decided to stock. Now, Lake Brittle has an actual walleye population that is, if you're solely looking at electro fishing and studies the biologists do, has a larger population of walleye than Lake Burke in Fairfax. Lake Burke is a highly pressured lake in Fairfax County. Fairfax County is still, it may be number 2. Historically, it's been the number 1 populated county in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'm pretty sure they still hold that level. I mean, a lot of people live in Fairfax County, Virginia, and right outside D.C. So it is one of the most highly pressured lakes in the entire Commonwealth. It just is. Recreational anglers, all that stuff. Lake Brittle is a little bit further out. It's off. You can get to it from basically anywhere in the Beltway region, from 495 to 66. And then it's in Fauquier, just over into Fauquier County. So it's between Warrenton and Gainesville, and it's out there, and so you slowly get to, less populated areas as you go out 66 west, which is good in terms of the balance of that fishery, in terms of the pressure that it sustains, especially for juvenile, in terms of, who is actually removing fish from the fishery. A lot of people don't talk about that stuff. You see that a lot at lakes, okay? The guy's got a bucket, okay? And there's not, regardless of what people say, you always hear the negative stuff, but there's not enough game wardens and conservation officers, okay, to cover all of these lakes and rivers across the Commonwealth, Maryland, and any of these places, right? And so a lot of times fish are being removed from these fisheries, outside of the legal regulations and creel limits and all of that. Okay, I'd be willing to bet that the numbers of the people that are caught violating those regulations are versus the number of people that are actually violating it is extremely, extremely low. And so they have to battle that in terms of fish populations. You know, whether people are intended to target those species or not. A lot of times you basically come into that was my impression. I was shocked to come into walleye, sawguys that walleye X and the hybrid in the lake, because I was going fishing for bass, right? Beginning of the fall transition, brand new lake. Let's kind of diagnose this lake a little bit, and you come into these species, and what happens if someone's catching that? Now, Lake Brittle's got a massive shoreline access, bank access for anglers, probably the most in Northern Virginia. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to be studied how many fish are actually being removed, you know, from the lake. But the numbers seem to be better at Brittle than Burke, and a lot of that could be what's being removed from Burke, you know, over time, because you kind of see that with the age during the electrofishing of the size fish that are actually being you know, caught in numbers. And in Lake Brittle, it's that 12 to 16 inch walleye versus that 20 to 27 inch, right? It just drops off a cliff. And so, to me, a lot of times that either signals a spawning year that was successful, that is now maturing and will continue to grow into that 19, 20, 21, 22 inch. Okay, we see that with smallmouth, where we have an abundance of 7-inch fish in the upper Potomac. That they're probably all one spawning class or one or two spawning classes. Okay? And then we've got a gap in that we have no fish of consequence, you know, 17 and 18 inches, and then you catch that 19. Okay? And so it's a weird, and a lot of that is spawning class, environmental, and then obviously the angler behavior and how much is being removed. So in terms of walleye, the average sample size of walleye the last few years for Brittle's been about 15 inches. So, I mean, that's higher. So that tells you that you've got 18-inch, you've got 18s and 19s, and then you've got 12s, because remember, it's an average. It's got an 18-inch minimum, okay, and a 5-day limit on the lake for a walleye, okay? So 18 is at the top end. If you start at 18, it goes down. Not a lot, but just down, 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 as opposed to 10 to 17, where the predominant number in the lake are that size that you should be returning to the lake. So they've stocked it continually since 1979. It doesn't mean they stock it every year, mates. It just means that's the commitment that they've had towards doing that. Where in Burke, if you look at the size length for Burke, it has considerably larger fish and not as many. So see how that dynamic works. Is they've got considerable numbers of walleye in that 19, 20, 21, 22 inch range. More so, okay, in terms of the results from the electrofishing. But the average is still the same. Okay? Like, you know what I mean? In terms of, the average removal, 5-day, it's got an 18-inch minimum, 5-day. It's the same as Lake Brittle. But your average walleye, you know, is almost 18 inches. Okay? In Burke versus 15 in Brittle. Now, Brittle's gotten a lot of stocking going on in the last few years that is going to actually drop that average, I would think, in the short term. It's just a matter of in the long term. And you guys know, if you know about the electrofishing in terms of it's how many fish caught per hour, you know, it is how they do it. when they electrofish. And you've got in Northern Virginia, you've got Lake Orange, okay, is another one for walleye. And this lake has produced walleye well above 5 pounds or in the 5 pound range. But its catch rates are lower than Burke and Brittle. Okay, so it's just kind of interesting, but it has the same 18-inch minimum and the same 5-day. Okay. So those are kind of all interesting in that Northern Virginia area. And then you totally have a totally different habitat and a totally different behavioral aspect of walleye in the Shenandoah River nearby, okay, that's coming towards the west in the valley, okay, because you've got all of these lakes kind of in the upper quadrant of Northern Virginia, and then just west in the valleys. The valley comes down to Virginia with West Virginia on the other side. You've got the Shenandoah River. You've got the Staunton River, okay, which is producing walleye like crazy, as opposed to the lakes. And a lot of that has to do with the rivers coming back. And so you kind of understand that that's, natural. We see that with smallmouths in the rivers and not as many smallmouth. I mean, you do in the valley, you've got lakes with smallmouth, but you don't really have smallmouth too saturated Central Virginia, Eastern Virginia. It's predominantly largemouth bass, right? And so you can kind of figure those things out when you look at these electrofishing rates, okay? When you just pick a species, I mean, everyone concentrates on bass, and everybody wants more bass, more bass, more bass. It's the largest population of anglers in the region, obviously, and then probably saltwater comes next if you're looking at if you factor in Maryland and Virginia in terms of popularity and people fishing in the bay. But it is just interesting to see, these different species dynamics, how they impact bass, because that's really the crux of the argument for a lot of people in lakes like Lake Brittle is they want places to go catch big bass. You've seen Virginia DWR stock Florida strain bass in places like Hunting Run, right? You've seen the push has always been bass, bass, bass. But DWR has to have a commitment to other fish species as well in hopes of maintaining not only, the differing sport angling communities, but also the balance of those particular fisheries, in terms of that. And it's really predicated on that and not as much on forage. And that's probably going to be the issue coming up in the future is forage classes and the sustainability of forage in fisheries, with all the various environmental conditions that happen. So those are predominantly your Northern Virginia areas for walleye. Obviously, there are more other locations in Eastern Virginia and like Philpott and and other places in the state that are going to have Leesville Lake, Chesden, that are going to have significant walleye populations, whether they are stocked or not. I think Staunton and Shenandoah rivers are the best river examples right now in Virginia. Definitely, Brittle and Burke, Orange in Northern Virginia. Eastern Virginia, you got Little Creek towards the east off of I-64. Chesden, as I mentioned, which is south of the city, south of Richmond in Chesterfield County and Dinwiddie County. Are the predominant, and then Leesville are predominantly the bigger walleye population. So it was just interesting to get out on Lake Brittle in search of bass for fall transition, and then to get in other species and to recognize, hey man, they got flathead catfish that are still were introduced by them, and blue channel cat. In that fishery, walleye and bass, all in that habitat on a 77-acre lake. And when I was out there, there was one guy on the pier and then one guy out on the water, and that was it. Obviously it was during the week. It wasn't a weekend. And we got into some walleye. And there's the thing about walleye, for me, my experience is, and it's limited, to be honest, mates, is they stack up. Like, you get into one, it's like chain pickerel. I grew up in Loudon, in Northern Virginia, and then moved down to Richmond, and we had a place down called Swift Creek Lake, not the reservoir, Swift Creek Lake, in a state park down there. And as a kid, we would go fishing. And if you get into one chain pickerel, you'd get into 30. Walleyes were the same way. You don't just catch one. That's been my experience. I don't know if that's a general thing, but at least here in a DMV and in Virginia, that's been my experience. Chain pickerel and walleye, you get into one, you get into 6. Unlike bass necessarily, you can catch one bass and that's it. Okay, 2 bass on that trip, and neither were scoreable based on what I was looking for. And so, but still, any bass is a good bass. But that's just how that is. When you catch it at the time and where you're fishing and in lakes and what you're covering and where you are fishing, laydowns, walleyes tend to like deeper pools and rivers. I always found that out interesting, as opposed to your smallies, things like that. That are a lot different when you fish in these lakes than when you're out on the river. So there's a learning curve there. In terms of those things, and you also sometimes are influenced by a thermocline, like in stuff like that, and where fish are going to be suspended, during transitions, especially going into fall, right? We have cooler nights now, shorter days, cooler nights, and water temperatures are coming down, and so all that is is going to influence not obviously our river, but also all our lakes and our impoundments. So it's just really interesting to get that out there on Lake Brittle. Great little ramp, easy facilities, easy act, very small parking area. Be mindful of that. There do have some trailer parking along the back along the wood line, but it is not a really big. I've seen smaller, but it's not a really big parking lot. For that, I imagine it gets jacked up pretty quick. But like I said before, tons of shoreline access for people to take a kid fishing, all the way around. Where the parking lot is. Very short ramp pier, and you've got a bigger pier that goes along the damish man-made area, of the lake. So that's just Lake Brittle was a really great trip. I'm going to go back, kind of deep dive into more of it, break it down, maybe do a lake breakdown coming up. But I just want to do a quick video on walleye, where Virginia walleye are at, and what VWR is doing with Virginia walleye. You can find out, I'll try and post their stocking plan as well. Probably find that on my Facebook page, JL Scott Fishing and Eats. I might try and put it in the description here for YouTube, for everyone on YouTube. And you can check out basically Leesville, Philpott, Staunton, Shenandoah, Lake Orange, Lake Burke, and Lake Brittle, and then Chesden and Little Creek in the eastern and south central Virginia for walleye. All right, mates.